Joy. It's not a word often associated with business books or leadership podcasts, but that's our subject matter today, joy, on episode 136 of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. I have a great guest today. I've just met him, but I've read most all of his brand new book. I'm going to tell you about that. We'll introduce him and we'll dive in. How about we do that? So Richard Sheridan is the CEO and co-founder of Menlo Innovations, which has won the Alfred P. Sloan Award for Business Excellence in the Workplace Flexibility for 6 straight years and 5 revenue awards from Inc. magazine. He frequently speaks at business conferences and to major corporations like Mercedes-Benz, Nike, and 3M. He is the author of Joy, Inc. and the brand new book, The Chief Joy Officer, and he lives and works in Ann Arbor, Michigan. If you're watching us, you can see his workplace behind the glass door. Richard, welcome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
So I get books all the time that show up, people pitching to have either them or the person that they're pitching on the show. And I got this book in the mail. Chief Joy Officer said, okay, so unless this is like really, really woo-woo, I already know I want this book. And I took about 4 minutes to find out, no, it's not too woo-woo. It's not, in fact, it's not at all. And in fact, if the book's got joy in the title and love in one of the chapter headings, I'm all in. But listen, Richard's from Michigan, so it's not woo-woo. It's really great stuff. So Richard, let's start by telling us a little bit about your journey. You are the perfect guest for me in that when we started the show, we said we wanted to have leadership experts and expert leaders. And I think you're both. So tell us about the journey of how you get to this place.
Yeah, for me, the journey started when I was a kid. I started out as a kid programmer just north of Detroit back in 1971. I think a lot of young people wonder, there were computers back in 1971. They were a little different than they are today. Got my first job as a programmer while I was still in high school, which I was amazed people would pay me for this thing I love to do as a hobby. Eventually came up here to the grand and glorious University of Michigan and got a couple of degrees in computer science and computer engineering and launched a career. And I thought, and I got the world by the tail. I've got something I'm good at. I've got something that's needed and expanding. And it's going to carry me for a lifetime. And so I thought, this is awesome. And but very quickly, I started falling into what I call a personal trough of disillusionment, where my expectations didn't match the results. The world was rewarding me. I kept getting raises and promotions and stock options and all that sort of thing. But I was disappointed. And by my mid-30s, I didn't even want to be in the industry anymore. And it was probably, anybody who's worked on hard things has experienced what I did. And anybody who's worked in the software industry has probably certainly experienced what I have. And that is, blown budgets, missed deadlines, lousy results, crappy quality, unhappy users, unhappy customers. And I thought, wow, maybe I'm not cut out for this. Maybe I need to be smarter. And so I started kind of looking around the industry, and I realized, no, this is an industry-wide problem.
This is us. Here we are, right?
And
not just programming and IT either, which I know by now but half of the things you just described is project managers the world over, right?
Absolutely. And so I was simultaneously disillusioned, and then my optimist kicked in. I was stuck in a room full of manure, and I was going to keep digging because I knew there was a pony in here somewhere. So my journey out actually led me to authors and books, but not books on technology. What I was interested in was management, organizational design, systems thinking. And so I was drawn to Tom Peters and Peter Drucker and Peter Senge and John Naisbitt, who wrote a great book called Megatrends. And all these, yeah, isn't that great? I mean, it's amazing how, I don't know how he did it, how he so accurately foresaw the age we're in today.
He pretty much nailed it.
Oh, he did. It's incredible. I still use one of his quotes in almost every one of my talks around the world, where it says that the greatest invention that will occur in the century we're in now will not occur because of technology, but because of an expanding concept of what it means to be human. And boy, are we learning that today more than ever, right? As our technology is tending to separate us as humans rather than bring us together. And so I was intrigued. I was reading these books. I was inspired by them. But none of them were telling me how to get from the place I was to where I wanted to go. That was sort of left as an exercise to the reader, I think.
Well, you got to do some of the work, Richard. I mean,
that's right. Yeah,
Tom would say reading it is fine. And by the way, you're talking about Tom Peters. He's been a guest on the show. If you're just now watching, you want to go back and find Tom's episode. But yeah, he would say it's fine to read it, but you got to go do something, right?
That's true. Yeah. And, and he's become a good friend over the years. He did the foreword to my book, which I was just so honored by. So I kept getting these raises and promotions. The world kept telling me, no, you're doing great. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Stop telling me I'm doing well. We could do so much better. And in 1999, after I'd been vice president for a couple of years for a high-flying tech firm here in Ann Arbor, I made some big decisions, some big moves that looked to the outside world like they were risky. And but for me, the risk was I didn't think I could do this for another 30 years and survive. And this was the thing that was carrying me, my family, paid for the house and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, I can't do this anymore. And so I made some big changes, and it all worked. It's just, and I'm still doing those same things today, now almost 20 years later. And that's what we write about in the book.
It is. So 2 books I have told you all the titles, and they both have a unique word in them for business books, and that 3-letter word is joy. So I know in Joy Inc. you talk about culture. So let's actually start there. We'll obviously talk about the new book here in a second, but what does it mean, or what does it look like to have a joyful culture, and why? So I guess 2 parts. Why that word? Yep. And then what does it mean to you to have a joyful culture?
The word has been around in our lexicon here at Menlo almost from the earliest days, but it's sat kind of idle for the earliest years. And then somebody sent me the video that Simon Sinek did on Start With Why, his famous TEDx Puget Sound talk. And somebody sent me the video and said, Rich, you guys do this at Menlo. You start with why. And I watched the video and I got it. I understood why they said that. But I thought about it when all these visitors come, because we get thousands of people a year who come from all over the planet just to see how we do what we do. And when they came, I never started with why. I would always talk about, we're a software design and development firm. That's what we do. We have this unique approach in this open and collaborative work environment. That's how we do it. And I might eventually get to the why, but I never started with why. And so one tour that I was going to lead, I said, today's the day I'm going to start with why. And I thought, what am I going to say? What would our why be? And then when I looked at our mission statement, and our mission, simply stated, is to end human suffering in the world as it relates to technology. And we take it very seriously, although we can say it tongue-in-cheek, we can laugh. Everybody laughs when we say it because everybody has experienced technological suffering, even if they're not in the tech industry. And I thought, that's what I want. I want everybody who comes to Menlo from here on out to walk out with one word on their mouth: suffering. No, that might not be a good idea.
Rethink that one, Richard.
Rethink that one. So right down at the bottom, almost waiting for me like a gift at that moment, was a sentence we'd written in our earliest days that said, our goal since we founded the company in 2001 is to return joy to technology. And I'm like, of course, that's it. So these people came in, I said, welcome to Menlo. I said, you have come to a place that has very intentionally created a culture focused on the business value of joy. Now, let me tell you, at that moment, they're all looking at me like, what on earth are you talking about, right? And he said, Rich, we're here to learn about how you do what you do in the crazy environment you have. Why are you talking about joy? And I'm pointing back to this wonderful room full of people. I said, well, let's say you had a project. Let's say that for some weird cultural reason, half of my team had joy and the other half didn't. Which half would you want working on your project? Yeah. And they said, well, we'd want the joyful half. Of course. I said, why? What difference would it make? Why would it matter to you? And they said, well, they'd be more engaged. They'd care more about the outcome. They'd produce higher quality. They'd, and I'm like, boom. So you're with me. There is, in fact, tangible, measurable business value to joy.
It's not woo-woo. It's not soft. It's not squishy. It is business results, right?
Absolutely. And so we've gotten better at articulating this. And one of my favorite companies on the planet is the Arbinger Institute. And they recently wrote a book called The Outward Mindset. And I talk to people about the fact that our joyful intention is externally focused. We want the work of our hearts, our hands, and our minds to get out into the world and delight the people it's intended to serve. And so for us, the culture and its purpose must be externally focused on crisply being able to answer two fundamental questions. Who do you serve? And what would delight look like for them?
So if you're watching us, by the way, if you're listening, there is a video version of this podcast. And if you're watching, you say, why does Kevin look distracted? It's because Kevin was trying to find the episode number for when I had Jim Farrell, the author of The Outward Mindset, on the show, episode number 31. So if you're listening to us or watching us, and you might want to go back and listen to the conversation that Jim and I had, it's been almost 2 years now since we had that conversation, Richard. So the questions were, who do we serve and how do I delight them?
Yeah.
Or how do we delight them, right? I love that word delight because everyone uses the word satisfaction. And I'm like, that didn't stir anybody's soul. So I really love the idea of customer delight. How do we delight the folks with what we're delivering? And I'm sure you're talking about that internally, externally, et cetera. Yes?
Yep. And with podcasters who call me and say, let's talk.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so that's what I asked you before we started. What can I do to make this what you really want? And you said, Kevin, we'll have a conversation. I said, I can do that. So the new book isn't about culture, although it is, because we're talking about leadership. And so it's, again, we are talking with Richard Sheridan. We're talking about the brand new book, Chief Joy Officer, How Great Leaders Elevate Human Energy and Eliminate Fear. Anyway, so this book has two sections. And the first section is really about joyful leadership, or being a joyful leader. And so there are 7 characteristics. You don't need to tell us the whole book, but can you I'm going to dive into a couple of them, but can you just sort of outline the 7 for everybody real quick?
Yep. And so what we looked at, and what I, when you start writing a book like this, you're like, so what should exactly we talk about? So one of the things we talk about is our values. And it's the word values for me, you get into a lot of companies that talk about mission and vision and values. And the word values for me always kind of plopped. It didn't land well for me. And I don't know why, but when somebody said, what are your values? And for some reason, the question never made sense to me. I just changed the question a little bit and everything made sense. What do you value? Now, it's a slight change in English, But when I think about what we value, we talk a lot about our values here at Menlo as a company, and I actually outline how we even came up with them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a set of values that go across the entire organization. But I realized that as leaders, there's an extra burden on leaders. And now the question is, if you truly want to be a strong leader, a leader that someone wants to follow, which I think are the only good kind of leaders there are ones who actually engender followership, right? Otherwise, you're on a parade of one. Nobody's, you're just out on a walk.
You're on a walk and you're taking a walk by yourself, right?
That's right. So I stepped back and said, what is it about leaders that would engender followership? And so I just talk about the things that I've seen over the course of my personal career and what I've admired in others. And it's things like authentic and humble and loving, which is you might have seen that one when you open them, like, oh, maybe this is woo-woo, right?
No, but I looked a little longer and I was good. I was all good. In fact, that's one of them I want us to talk about, but go ahead.
Yeah. Optimism, vision, reality, and servant leadership. I mean, these were all the ones that, as I reflected on my own personal history, our journey here at Menlo, and what I saw in others, these were the ones that really popped out to me.
Okay, cool. So I do want to talk about a couple of them, and since you've already mentioned it, let's start there. Loving. I am 100% with you, and yet there are probably some people who go, oh, here comes the woo-woo from the two boys from Michigan. But so let's talk about that, because I am right with you, but I think a lot of people are afraid of that word in this context or don't think it makes sense in this context. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Well, as I say in the book, love wins every time in life and in work. I don't think we get to the place we want to get. And this is maybe where, again, I appreciate so much the teachings of the Arbinger Institute. How do we connect with each other as human beings? And it was interesting because when I first started this chapter, when I first started writing it, I talked more about being gentle.
About being
gentle. That might have even been an early version of this chapter. And I think I knew love was the right word, but I was hesitant because joy is kind of like that too. I mean, my first book
you've already got joy right on the cover.
Right.
I mean, I think you're safe at that point.
When I give talks, I tell people, I say, yep, I'm the guy who had the audacity to release a business book to the world that has the words joy and love on the cover, because Joy Inc. says, Joy Inc., how we built a workplace people love. And I thought, am I going to be taken seriously, right? Because I don't want to put people off by all of this. And, and it was also kind of fun because I probably did the next bold thing, and I took the First Corinthians chapter about love, and I just picked apart every piece, and I said, you know what that biblical passage says about love can also be said about leadership. And it worked. I wasn't sure. I just started writing. I wrote from the heart at that point, and it made so much sense to me. If you think about what does it mean, I remember one time my youngest daughter, who asked me all these provocative questions from time to time, she said, Dad, do you love me unconditionally? I think she was taking some philosophy course or something. And, and I could tell by the way she was asking the question, it deserved a thoughtful answer, not just absolutely, honey, of course I do. I'm your dad. Why wouldn't I? And it actually caused me to reflect on what does it mean to love someone unconditionally. And I think it does mean we're going to be patient. We're going to be kind. We're going to care about each other. We're going to, we're not going to use you to get to a certain point in our relationship so that I can get ahead of you and all those sort of things. That I'm going to care so much about your personal development. And there's so many other leaders now that I see who are talking about these kind of issues. One of my favorites of late is Bob Chapman from Barry Waymiller in his book, Everybody Matters, and how he literally came to his own revelation when he was watching his daughter getting married and realized that everybody on his team is someone else's son or daughter, right? And why wouldn't we think about the people who work for us in that way, in that family way? And it changed how he ran a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing firm.
Yep. So loving leaders is one of the ideas that you talk about in the book, and you've just given us a good piece related to that. The other one is one that, while loving, Richard, isn't often used, another one on your list is used all the time, and that is authentic.
Yes.
And so I'd like us to talk about that one, because that one is been used so much by people like you and me that it's almost cliche, right? So let's talk about that one in terms of what it really means to you and how you all are trying to live it.
So I think our most finely tuned sense of smell is a smell for authenticity in another human being. And, you know, it may be that, you know, in our caveman days, if somebody said, hey, Rich, run over that hill and go, you know, something really good is going to happen over there. We had to make a judgment as to whether that was a good idea or not based on the person who was telling us to run over that hill. We watch for this. I think, you know, as leaders, we have a tough job in front of us, because we can do 100 good things and screw it up once and lose them forever, right?
Yeah.
And that has always weighed on my mind, is how do we be that leader someone wants to follow for a lifetime? And I think this is the part where they both want us to be all the other things I talked about: visionary, optimistic, grounded in reality, servant leadership, and all this sort of thing. But they also want to know we're a real human being.
And that we're fallible, and that we struggle, and
then we can be scared from time to time ourselves, and then we can lean on those around us. And it really hit home with me with the story I tell in the book. It's just one of my favorite stories. Even when I read the audiobook, I couldn't get through it without crying a few times. And it was about that nonprofit I talk about called Ellie's Place, which was started in Lansing, Michigan by the Stovers when their young daughter Ellie died at 11 months old. And they had no place to go to grieve. They had, particularly for their children. Their children didn't know, they had 4 other kids, their kids didn't know how to process the emotion of having lost their younger sister. So they started up Ellie's Place. We had them in for a lunch and learn here. And they ran through this exercise. They were just teaching us about their nonprofit in the hopes that we would support them in some way. And they talked about this lesson, structured lesson they go through with teens in particular, about a plastic white mask. And they had the teams write on the outside of the mask what they thought the world wanted to hear. And so the outside of the mask would say, I'm fine now. I've moved on. I'm better. I'm happy. And you know, that's what they thought the world wanted to see. On the inside of the mask, they wrote down their private thoughts. Why, God? Bitter, angry, guilty. And then they had the teens who weren't related share the inside of their mask with each other. And what they saw for the first time ever is how many other people in the world shared the same emotions they had. And I thought about that exercise as I was writing the book, and I thought, yeah, this is what leadership's like, isn't it? The outside of the leader's mask, the one we put on just after we get done brushing our teeth and before we hop in the car and head to work, says, I'm confident, I've got this, you know, don't worry about things. I've got it covered.
We've got a plan, et cetera.
We've got a plan. We're going to execute our strategy and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, some of that's important, of course. But what would the inside of a leader's mask say? I'm worried. I don't know if we're going to make it through this. I need your help. And, you know, that's not how people tend to view the strongest business leaders. That may not be the business leader that makes it onto the cover of Fortune magazine or something like that. They want this belief that somehow leaders are superhuman. when in fact we're not. And I think if we can, and as I said, this isn't about displaying the full range of your emotions every day.
Or at every time, or yeah, exactly. That's what, I mean, I love that story. And I wanted, where you're headed now is, I think, so important. Because one of the reasons leaders don't want to be authentic is they say, well, does that mean everything? Does that mean I'm a completely open book? Does that mean that I can't? And so say a little bit more about that. I kind of interrupted you, but I think that's such an important point here, where so many people get stuck. They say, well, that's a good idea, but I could never do that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe in the strategy either that says, if you don't like me in my underwear, I don't care if you like me in a suit kind of attitude either.
Let me be clear. There'll be no Kevin in his underwear on this show.
Yeah, exactly. But I think they need to know, the people we're leading need to know we're real. We're an actual human being. And in knowing that, they can start to see how we care for them and how they can perhaps aspire to their own journey to joyful leadership, because they see, oh, I don't need to be a superhuman all the time. I don't need to be the person who has all the answers every second. I don't need to be seen as the smartest person in the room. And I think at that point, you start to invert that pyramid and you become the servant leader.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And you can support the growth of the people because you're willing to be vulnerable with them. And I think they need that. I think the people we lead need that. And I want to be very clear here, because a lot of people ask me about this. They're like, Rich, is this a book just for CEOs? And I'm like, oh, no.
Oh, no, not even close.
Leadership can occur at every layer of an organization. We just had somebody join here. She's doing a great job. She's already leading. She's only been here a few months. And we're embracing that in her. And so, now the question is, how do you become a better version of leader as time goes on?
Absolutely. So we have spent, everybody, the whole episode talking about the first half of the book. There's a whole second half of the book that's about creating joyful leaders, or sort of the leadership development, of the cultural of how do we do this in our organization. We don't have time to go into all that, but I wanted you to just say a couple of words about one of those ideas that you talk about there, and that is storytelling. In fact, I think you call yourself the chief storyteller.
It's true. It's on my business card now.
And so again, we're in agreement here. And so I would just ask you this question: why is storytelling so important to leaders from your perspective?
Everybody wants, so let's back up to culture just for a second, right? A lot of people, they have culture questions in their head. If you're founding a company, if you jump in as a new CEO, if you're an old CEO that needs to, improve the culture, I always say that every organization has a culture. Most of them are default cultures, not intentional. And if you choose to be intentional about your culture, and regardless of what our word is joy, and I would definitely encourage others to think about it in that regard. But the idea is, once you choose a culture, a strong cultural intention, now the question is, how do you communicate it? Because in life, we've learned that saying things once, putting on a poster on the wall that gets hung in the bathroom or in the lunchroom, doesn't seem to have much effect. Nope. And so where do we connect to people, and how do we connect to them? And I realized in all these tours we do here at Menlo, we tell a lot of stories on the tours. We tell the stories of our history. We tell, like I started out with my personal story about how did I get to be the guy who's now writing books about joy. Mm-hmm. And in those stories, we start connecting with the hearts of the people who are in front of us. Now, I used to think the stories were for the people who are coming to visit. But it dawned on me, because our tours actually are being led throughout the big open room that you see behind me here, the team was listening over and over and over again. And then one time, Ian told me, he said, Rich, every time you walk by and you're telling one of your stories, I've heard it 100 times, I stop and I listen. And he said, it's like you're telling it for the first time. I don't know how you do that. And I told him, I said, well, Ian, when you're telling stories from the heart, when you're telling stories about what you love, it will always sound fresh. But in that exchange, I realized, oh my gosh, these stories aren't for our tour guests alone. It's reinforcing Menlo's story over and over again. And I thought about storytelling and its arc in human history, right? How did we propel civilizations and tribes and nations forward? It was around campfires and totem poles and, anthems and all this sort of thing. And I realized, no, what do? We curate the stories that best describe either what we're trying to avoid, the pain, because sometimes we need to tell painful stories to remind us of why we've chosen to be where we are, or we tell stories of hope and aspiration. And the stories we curate, the stories we choose to tell over and over again, are the ones that are communicating, as leaders in particular, what is the most important thing about what we do and why we do it the way we do it.
And the best way to communicate that and almost anything else is through a story, right? So Rich, we're going to take a short little respite before we get to the closing of the show. By the way, everybody, we had a great episode, one of the most watched, one of the most listened episodes ever, by a leader, Sandy Coletta. Episode 73 was all about storytelling. So if Richard has just sort of got you thinking more about that, there's lots of great resources to read about that, and you certainly could go to episode 73 and listen to Sandy and I talk about that. But we're going to go into what I call, Rich, the fast break. I have 3 ideas for you. I'm going to ask you to share your first reactions to those 3 ideas. You don't have to be long, just sort of what do you think about these 3 things? And this fast break is brought to you, everybody, by our brand new ongoing leadership development process called The Remarkable Way. And you can learn more at kevineikenberry.com/way. So I have these 3 ideas for you, Rich. The first one you already mentioned. We didn't talk about it, but you mentioned the words. And then the other 2, you don't have any idea. So in fact, you don't have any idea what any of them are. The first one is systems thinking.
Yes. Yeah, it's I believe that culture without process leads to chaos, and culture and process without culture leads to bureaucracy. And so how do we fit together our cultural intentions in a way that actually enlivens and engenders the spirit of the team? And I think as leaders, one of the most important things we need to do is be systems thinkers, so we can avoid the chaos that is. I mean, chaos is a weird thing, right? Chaos keeps us busy. Chaos keeps us excited and energized and all that sort of thing. But eventually our little adrenaline pumps run out, and then one day we're burned out and we wonder what the heck happened. And I would believe that chaos is the result of a lack of systems thinking.
All right. Second word, accountability.
Probably one of the most dangerous words in American management today. Because what I see in accountability is a lopsided version of accountability, where a leader points to you and says, Kevin, I need you to be accountable, right? And that feels like leadership. And it's like, okay, that's neat, but what are you going to do in return, right? I think accountability has to be circular and balanced. And
I talk about we need to hold people accountable, but we also have to help them be accountable, right? We're saying, I think, very much the same thing.
I mean,
We're together, right?
Is, Kevin, I need you to have this done by Wednesday. Like, okay, are you going to take some things off my plate? Are you going to ask me if it's possible to get it done by Wednesday, right? Or did you just add one more log on my fire?
With no conversation, with no clue about whether that's possible or what I'm going to choose to drop when you tell me that, right? Because if you don't help me figure that out, I'm going to pick something and you won't be happy with that either.
And usually when I hear the word accountability in any managerial discussion, it is overloaded with fear.
Mm-hmm.
And fear is the mind killer. Fear destroys creativity and imagination and innovation and invention. And if we get to that point, you've lost your team member. They will deliver what you asked them to deliver, but you won't get what you thought you wanted.
Unintended consequences. So everybody, there's always at least one time in every episode, Richard, where I say it to everybody, you should have written this one down. I'm going to just go back and say it. You've said several things today that people really ought to pay close attention to and go back and maybe listen again, but you just said something a second ago. Fear is a mind killer. And so that right there, everybody, that one sentence worth listening to this whole conversation. Because if we, and obviously we haven't really talked about fear. Fear is in the title of the book. And again, we are talking with Richard Sheridan about Chief Joy Officer, how great leaders elevate human energy and eliminate fear. But I think that's just so profoundly true. And I appreciate the way that you said that. So I said I was going to give you 3 words. I'm only going to give you 2. We're going to move on. I've got a couple of final questions to ask you. So thank you for playing along when you didn't know what those 2 things were going to be. And now everyone is wondering what the 3rd one would be. And I'll just have to save that for somebody else another day. What do you do? Like, what do you do for fun? You got all this stuff you're doing. You're running this organization. You're helping to lead this organization. You're writing books. You're out speaking about what you're doing. You're giving tours, for heaven's sakes. What do you do for fun?
Well, you and I both know the grand state of Michigan enjoys 4 lovely seasons, a couple of which you can play golf in, which I do. I wish
Some people you could say you play it in 3 of them, but in Michigan, maybe it's only like 2.5.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And then I am an avid skier. I usually leave the state to go do that, but you can get a little bit of skiing in around Michigan as well. But those 2 things, and whenever they relate either to my children or my now growing grandchildren, extra delight there.
Got it. And so the second to last question that Richard, that I have for you is, and I know from the book that you, like me, are a reader, but the question is, so what are you reading now, or what's something you've read recently that people might find interesting or that you just want to share?
Yeah, I've,
excuse me.
Bless you. In the back of the book, as you know, I have this recommended teachers section and a whole bunch of books that I have personally read or our team has read that have greatly influenced our thinking. So at the very least, what I want to do is encourage your listeners to be readers. Leaders are readers. Leaders are students. The book that has had the greatest impact on my life in the last few years I was pointed to by someone who came here and said, "Oh my gosh, you've obviously read Leadership and Self-Deception by the Arbinger Institute." I said, "Nope, never heard of them, never heard of the book." And they said, "You got to be kidding me. You have to read this book." And when I read that and the follow-on book, The Anatomy of Peace, it shook me to my core. It convicted me that, and it helped me through that conviction to be a better human being. My wife would even claim that it made me this much better of a husband through the lessons of that book. And,
so both of us, neither of us want to probably give marriage advice, and yet, I am of the strong belief, and I think anyone who's listened to very many of these podcasts won't be surprised when I say that I think that you can't be a better leader without becoming a better human being. I don't think it's possible. And so I think the great benefit of doing what you and I get the opportunity to do every day, both in leading and in talking to others about it, is that, we are convicted every single day. And hopefully we move closer to what we're capable of becoming in that process. So, the last question, the question you've been wanting me to ask since the very beginning, where can we learn more about Menlo? Where can we get a copy of the book? All that stuff. Tell us about that.
Well, the book itself is sold wherever books are sold. All the classic places for that. Menlo itself, you can go to our website, menloinnovations.com. And we would encourage your listeners to just come and visit, come and see us. I think a lot of people who read business books like I did probably at some point or another said to themselves, man, a real life example would be really good right about now. We are one of those living, breathing examples. You can come visit us. We dive in, we go all around. I tell people there's no stone we're unwilling to turn. We'll look at everything good and bad. So we're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. This is a real company with real people in it, but you can come see it.
All right, Ann Arbor, Michigan, everybody. And so, Richard, thank you so much. But before we go, I've got to ask the question of everybody listening. I'm done asking Richard. I'm asking you. So the question is, now what? What are you going to do with the last 30 some minutes, 40 minutes almost of this conversation? What are you going to do differently, or what are you going to examine, or what are you going to work on yourself as a result of this conversation to put more joy in your work, in your workplace, in your life? What will you take from this and take action on? I know that we both would feel that this was sort of wasted if that didn't happen. And so, Richard, thank you so much for being my guest, and to have this conversation with you today. It was a great pleasure.
I think we could have talked all day, Kevin.
I'm pretty confident that we could have. And so everybody, I get the great opportunity to do this every week with other great, smart people. Why aren't you coming back every week right here? Another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We'll talk to you all then.